Let us now understand how to reconcile our diff to stateful component. So I'll come to my todo-app.js file and comment out the unnecessary render methods in here. So once I save this and do a refresh on the screen, nothing should be outputted, right? Because we are not yet hosting any component in here. So now let us write the required code to see how we can diff two components. But before that, let's create a couple of components in here. So I'll just put a comment diffing or reconciliation of two stateful components. So we will create two stateful components, and I'll just copy the component and put in here for your reference and then take you through it. So we have a new class called stateful component that extends from tinyreact.component. It has a constructor that takes in a props, and as a rule, whenever you have a constructor, you call the parent constructor by invoking the super method and passing in the props as well. Now every stateful component should have a render method, and that will return a JSX or a virtual DOM. Now within this render method, we have a div with an h2 wherein we are outputting the value of the props, and then we have a button with a text update, and we have an on click on the button, and whenever the click happens, we will invoke a method called update, which is not yet written at this point in time. So the update method looks like this. So what happens in the update is whenever this update button is clicked, we will again re-render the stateful component, but we will pass in a new prop title, right? So that we can see how things work or reconciliation works when the props changes, and there are two different virtual DOM trees created, one with the old state and the other with the new state. Now before we do this, I'll render this component first so that we can see the first version of this. Okay, so we are rendering this stateful component onto our root element, and at this point in time, if I go back and refresh the screen, I should see some output in here. Okay, so we can see task 1 with an update button. Now what will happen at this point in time when I click on this update button, we'll again invoke the render method, right? And we are passing in the stateful component with a new title, right? Which is nothing but the current date and time that we have. So let's see that. So if I click update button at this point in time, you can see the update happening in here, right? But the difference now being, now if I go back to this element and expand this root element for a moment, okay, now take a look at this. I'll do a refresh, and we can see this task 1 and the update button, right? Now when I click on this update, this entire component is remounted. Now we don't want that to happen. We only want this specific props to change, right? Because if you take a look at the code, the only thing that is changing in the component is the title, right? And we don't want this div to be rendered. We don't want this button to be rendered. We only want this title to be updated. Now if you go back in here and take a look at this update, now the moment I click on this update, observe the right hand side in here, right? The entire thing will be refreshed. Okay, you see, entire thing is kind of refreshed. Okay, this is where we need to add the reconciliation algorithm, wherein only the difference between these two virtual DOM will be applied. Let us now add the required code to reconcile this to stateful component. Now open up the dom.js file, and the first thing that we will do is to go open up the diff method in here and get a handle to the old component. So I'll write let old component is equal to, if there is an old VDOM, then and then only grab the component reference. Now you will recollect from our earlier session that every virtual DOM that we create, which is a stateful component, has a reference to the component within the component property. Now once you do this, you need to make a couple of more changes. Okay, now head on to the diff component method. Okay, this is where we will be adding the required code. Now if you take a close look at the diff component method, right now we are only taking into consideration one scenario, right? So if there is no old component, the entire element is mounted. Now we need to add the logic in here to actually diff these two components, right? If they are of the same type. Okay, this is where the code will come into play. So I'll do a slight modification to this code. So instead of only kind of mounting it, I'll put in the new code in here and then take you through the code. Okay, so the new code looks like this. So what we are doing in here is we are checking whether the old component and the new virtual element, they are of the same type. Now we have to write this is same component type method, which we will do shortly. And if they are of the same type, we'll invoke a method called as update component, which we have to write, which takes in the new virtual element, the old component, the container, and the DOM element. Otherwise we do the normal stuff of mounting the element, right? So this is the old code kind of. Now let's implement this isSameComponent function. The isSameComponent method is very simple. It takes in an old component and a new virtual element, and then it checks if there is an old component. If if and only if there's an old component, it compares the type of the new virtual element to the old component's constructor. So if the type of the new virtual element is same as the old component's constructor, that essentially means both the components are same, and now we only need to do the reconciliation. Let us now step by step add the update component method. So the update component method is kind of quite lengthy but simple to understand. Now the first thing that we will do is invoke the lifecycle method. Now see, at this point in time we have determined that both the component type is same, right? So before we update this component, what we will do is call the component will receive props of the old component, okay, and pass in the new prop. Now this is an indication that if this old component implemented this lifecycle method called component will receive props, okay, that method will be invoked and the new props will be passed to it. Now it's up to that old component to take whatever action that is required in this method. So now once this lifecycle method is called, we'll kind of check the other lifecycle method. Okay, so remember this should component update lifecycle method, right? By default, if you take a look at this should component update method, it's simply comparing the top level values of the state and the props. And if this method returns true, then and only then we will re-render the component, right? That's where this performance optimization comes into play. Okay, so by default it just do a shallow checking, which may not be very appropriate all the time, and in certain situations you will override this method, or rather in many situations you will override this should component update method and implement your own logical check here to identify the difference that is happening. Okay, so once we discuss on that, we'll go back to our update component method. Okay, and do the further implementation. Now see, if you take a look at this, we are kind of invoking this should component update on this old component and passing in the new virtual props. Okay, we'll see an example of this where how this comparison is kind of happening. Now if the should component update returns true, then we grab the previous props from the old component, and once we have this previous prop, we'll again invoke a lifecycle method called component will update. Now see, before updating the component, this component will update lifecycle method will be called, and we are passing in the new prop and the old state. So now what this old component will do this method will depend upon the implementation again. Okay, we are just invoking the lifecycle method. So we have one lifecycle method in here and one more lifecycle method check here. Okay, and then the third one in here, right? So now once we correctly hook these lifecycle methods, we have to update the components prop now, right? Because here now in here we are saying component will update. After that we will say old component dot update the prop with the new method. Okay, now we have to kind of implement this update props method. Let's kind of go back to our component class, okay, and implement this update prop method there. So update prop is kind of a very simple method. We just have to set the props. Okay, so we have this update prop method that takes in the props and assign it to the instance property called props. Okay, so once this is done, we'll come back to our update component method in again. Okay, and then generate the new VDOM. Okay, now the render should be called. Okay, so what we do is we generate the new VDOM, right? So how is the new VDOM generated? So we'll grab the old component and invoke the render method. Now this render method will give us the new VDOM. Now once we get the new VDOM, we set the reference of the component back to the old component. Now once we do this step, we have to recursively diff again, so that all the child elements are taken care of, right? So that's where the recursive diff will come into play. So what we are doing in here is we are calling the diff with the new virtual DOM, the container, the DOM element, and the old component. Once we kind of do this recursively diff, we again will invoke the lifecycle method called component did update, because at this point in time the component is updated with the new props kind of thing, right? That's where this lifecycle method comes. Now let us quickly revise what we did. So in the to-do app, we created a component called stateful that has some initial prop being passed from the render method here, right? So by default, the title that we are passing as the prop is task 1. Then we have a button, and on click of the button, we are invoking a method called update. And what update does is it renders this component again and passing in a new prop, okay, for the title, okay, when the new date is there. Now once we grab these two information, so we are implementing this feature in this dom.js file, right? So let's go back to the dom.js file. The first thing that we did is in the diff, we are grabbing in the old component. Okay, so once we grab in the old component in here, Okay, there's one more thing that we will do in here. So there's a check in here, right? The type of vdom.type is a function, right? Now you remember, right? We call this diff component, but we are passing null for the component, right? Because at that point in time, we haven't implemented the stateful component. Now in this case, we'll pass in the component reference. Okay, so this will complete this piece of the code. Now, once we are inside this diff component, we check whether this component is of the same type. And if it is of the same type, we invoke the update component method. Now, right within this update component method, the first thing that we will do is to invoke the lifecycle event called component will receive props and pass in the new props. Okay, and then depending on whether the should component update returns true or false, we are actually going inside this method and we are updating the props and creating the new VDOM, then recursively doing the diff again, and then finally kind of invoking a method called component date update. Okay, so once we make these changes, we can go back to the browser in again and do a refresh. Okay, I'll also kind of expand this element section in the Chrome developer too. Now let's take a close look at this task one, right? Now what should happen is this entire thing should not be refreshed. Only this task one should be replaced by the new date value that we are updating. Okay, let's see whether this is working or not. So click on update. Okay, now at this point you get an error, right? So let's take a look at the error and fix this thing. So if I go back to the console, the error that we are getting in here is component is not defined. Okay, so let's take a look at, click on this dom.js file. And we have this error called component is not defined. Okay, let's fix this part in here, right? Because here this component is not component but called all component. There's a slight typo in here. Okay, let's fix that part. So head over to the dom.js file and let's fix the typo. So we have the diff method here, we have the old component here, and instead of component just pass it as old component. Okay, save the file and go back to the browser and do a refresh. And open up the Chrome developer tool and bring up this element section. Okay, let's see whether this entire thing is updated or only this h1 is changing, right? So click on update and you'll see this only the date is getting updated, and that's why things are still intact, right? It is not collapsing like this. So I'll do an update one more time. See, have a look at this. Okay, this is how reconciliation works with stateful component. Next topic that we'll be doing is taking a look at what is ref and where we can make use of the ref feature in React. Okay, and we'll enhance our tiny React library with the ref functionality as well.